What's going on, Rebel Nation? We are back with another episode of the Rebel Talk. I'm your host, Zach Mareth. I'm back with our co-host, Dalen Flowers. Took a little bit of a break here, but now we got a lot to uncover. Recent commitment from Emmanuel Tucker, the offensive tackle from New Albany. He recently flipped from LSU to Ole Miss this morning. So credit to John Garrison. Hopefully we see that success translate on the field tomorrow in Lexington. But we're going to hit you guys with an injury report, some of our bold takes, and ultimately give you some predictions for this game, which has a lot of bad blood circling around it, Dalen. But before we get into that, let's touch on Emmanuel Tucker. This is the second flip we've seen on the offensive line in back-to-back years. It happened with Devin Harper last year. Are things trending in the recruiting world for John Garrison, Dalen?
I think it's a huge get, and I think you look at it as Dante Moncrief's first kind of huge commitment, and first commitment at Ole Miss. It's definitely a big pivot movement for Ole Miss in terms of the recruiting for 2026, especially with the in-state guys. This is huge just because it's an in-state guy, not only because it's a four-star offensive tackle that decommitted from LSU to commit to Ole Miss, but Ole Miss is really struggling in the class of 2026 recruiting in terms of the in-state guys. They only have 2 commits from top 20 guys in the state of Mississippi for next year, and a lot of those guys, those top 15 guys, a collection of them maybe 5 or 5 stars, and the rest are 4 stars. So Ole Miss has definitely been missing out on some in-state talent for next year's high school class. So getting Emmanuel is really big. It now moves the needle a little bit to work around some more guys that may have recently committed to other schools, such as Braylon Womack and Jason Matthews as well, that have those connections already with Ole Miss. That I am already aware that Dante Moncrief has already been, working behind the scenes to get in contact with some of these other guys. It's huge. You can be the pivot for Ole Miss like Lane Kiffin has in terms of being the portal king, but you do still have to recruit high school at a strong base as well,
Right.
especially in state. That's the motto: stay in the SIP. Commit to the SIP. Keeping the guys home. That's the big thing, at least in terms of the recruiting basis for the high school market for Lane Kiffin and his staff, and in terms of his mantra. So getting Emmanuel Tucker is huge. It sets the foundation in terms of what Dante Moncrief wants to do and what he has the abilities to do this quickly already. It's huge. It speaks to his recruiting abilities, to speak to John Garrison's abilities, but as well, I've said this with you many times, man. Now the hard work begins. It's so hard to get these guys committed, but it's even harder to keep them there. And so you got them, great. Now it's hard to keep these guys at a place for a year or two, even committed before they get to the campus. So
Yeah.
now the hard work actually begins to keep them here, to keep other schools off his tail, and keep them an Ole Miss Rebel, which I think they're going to have a great chance to do with that, because it speaks volumes when a guy's committed to LSU as long as Emmanuel was, and then just flip to Ole Miss that quickly. So now the hard work does begin for Dante Moncrief and staff, but they're already on the right track for the recruiting monument that they want to get back on terms for the in-state recruiting guys next year.
Yeah, I'll be the first one to tell you, I was a little bit concerned when Kelvin Bolden left. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
he had unbelievable amount of ties down in Southern Mississippi. Obviously, he played
Yeah.
wide receiver there during college, but now you bring in Dante, a guy who not only knows the Ole Miss and Mississippi area, but also spent some time up in Memphis, has good
Yeah.
connections there and around the country, right? You're
Yeah.
looking at a guy who dominated in college and had several years in the NFL. So that's a great sign for Dante Moncrief and the
Yeah.
staff.
And real
I
quick,
think,
man,
yeah,
I think just speaking on that as well, I think really quickly, I think that may have binded into some of these out of state, some of these in-state guys going to different schools because Kelvin Bolden left. They didn't know really what was going to be going on at Ole Miss right now, and I think a lot of Ole Miss fans were as well scared of some of the out-of-state guys that Ole Miss have really recruited well may decommit because of Kelvin Bolden, leaving LSU. Those guys will stay. Now it's Moncrief's turn to get the in-state guys back on track to Ole Miss. And like you just said, he has the Mississippi connections. He's working around the state really hard. So that is really huge for Dante Moncrief. It really is.
yeah, it's phenomenal. And he's going to continue to do great things. And fortunately, that's a guy who is an Ole Miss alum. So I would I'd be willing to bet he's here for the foreseeable future,
Yeah.
to say the least. But obviously, Tucker, like you said, man, committed, but now it's you got to put in the work to keep him here until signing day. I will say, I think they're going to use Tucker as kind of a starting piece to the kids in Mississippi to be like, hey, Emmanuel did this. We want you to join him. So now that you have that momentum, I think the sky's the limit for Kiffin, especially on the offensive side, which definitely needs more help in the high school recruiting aspect. Moving into this weekend, Dalen, I want to briefly touch on the initial injury report.
Yeah.
This one that was released last night. We see this a lot. Lane loves to play these games and list several. There's way too many guys on the questionable list. He does it in the press conferences. He doesn't answer the questions about injuries. He's always done this. But we got Jalen Braxton questionable. He did not
Mhm.
play last week. Daquan Wright did play. He's questionable. Ricky Fletcher did play. He's questionable. And then Dante Core and Delano Townsend did not play. Out of those players, who do you think is the most important to be suited up in Lexington tomorrow, Dalen?
Yeah, I think it's funny. I think, you're right. I think Lane has always trickled with the media and the fan base about injuries and putting out certain reports before the games. But I honestly, in a way, think this is pretty close to accurate just in terms of what we saw last weekend, what the two of us watched throughout fall camp, and just I think the pertainment of keeping guys healthy throughout the entire season. What I want to remind Ole Miss fans is this now is the mindset of a long season for the Ole Miss staff and players. The mindset is now playoffs every single year. So enticing that means sometimes you have to do things a little bit differently. Sometimes you have to protect players to maybe remark if you now have a 15, 16 game season in terms of other years when you weren't having that. But back to your question, man, I think having Ricky Fletcher out there is obviously going to be important. He looked really well to me against Georgia State. I mean, I really was impressed with him throughout fall camp. His size, his ability, his athletic, movements. I thought he looked really good last week, and I thought he played the ball really well. I thought he did well in man coverage. And looks to be one of the I don't know if I'll say vocal leaders of the team, but his abilities, his big playmaking abilities really seem to set the standard for this Ole Miss defense and secondary. It seems when he makes a big play, the team rallies around that. When he
Yeah.
is on momentum, the team is getting around him and they feel the energy that he, then proceeds to, push out to the other guys. So I think Ricky Fletcher having him out there is going to be huge. I know he's questionable as of right now. I also think having Jalen Braxton out there is going to be huge, if possible, for Ole Miss. Obviously, like you just said, did not appear last weekend against Georgia State. Lane Kiffin said it was a medical issue, did not specify what that medical issue was, and we saw him throughout much of fall camp. I think he missed that first week. And then came back that second week and looked to be full fitting. So no telling truly what's going on with that. But I think that's going to be another huge fit for Ole Miss to have this weekend. I think, Sage Ryan had an okay weekend against Georgia State, had a couple miscues against the run game against Georgia State. But I thought Kapina Gushigan looked really well. I thought, surprisingly, TJ Banks being out there looked pretty decent as well. I think Jalen Braxton is going to give the mobility to the secondary that they need, not only to stop the passing game of opposition, but to stop the run game really well. So if they're able to put him against Kentucky, which is going to be huge, you got to understand that Kentucky, they want to run the ball against Ole Miss this weekend. They want to do the things that, may not show up in the box score, but it's going to allow them to win the game. You got to look at Dante Dowdle last weekend, over almost 130 yards against Toledo on a rushing touchdown. They want to control the tempo. They want to keep the Ole Miss tempo offense on the sideline. And, the big thing for me that stood out against, Kentucky last year, Zach, I don't even know if you know this or anyone really knows this. The time of possession that Kentucky had last year was 39 minutes compared to Ole Miss's 20. They kept the tempo offense off the field last year, which insinuated that they won the game. And they did. This is the same thing Mark Stoops is going to try to aim to do again this year in Lexington. So they're going to focus, I would assume, focus heavy on the run game this year. And I think Jalen Braxton is going to be huge for Ole Miss to kind of limit that and keep the momentum for, Kentucky down. I think a lot of those guys as well, Traylon Ray, Luke Has, you probably won't see it all. I think Delano Townsend is going to be huge. We'll talk about that a little bit more. The offensive line needs as much help as it can get. So I think having him back out there, if possible, is going to be huge for Ole Miss. But I think you're going to see a few guys we didn't see last weekend back on the field for Ole Miss this weekend.
I agree, man. And the one other name I want to discuss on the offensive side of things is Daquan Wright. Because look, Luke Has obviously being out means there's not necessarily that starting tight end aside from Daquan, obviously. I know they threw Caleb Odom in there a little bit, but you want a guy with experience and a guy with that middle of the field playmaking ability that we know Daquan has. So I fully expect him to be suited up, but he's a really important piece of that offense nonetheless, man. Moving into Kentucky, whew, they are 1-0, Dalen.
Mhm.
They took down Toledo 24-16 last week.
Yeah.
And typically, this is a game where you expect Ole Miss to roll into Lexington and absolutely dominate, but I can guarantee you that they have quite a bit of confidence after witnessing what Mark Stoops did last year. And obviously, Ole Miss, the fan base knows that anything's possible at this point.
Yeah.
I'll never forget asking my roommate last year, the morning of the game, I was like, dude, what are we going to do if we lose? And it came true. And we walked out of Vaught-Hemingway. It was an absolute funeral. So what does Ole Miss do differently this year? Like you mentioned, man, I think it starts and ends in the run game. On the defensive side of things, you got to stop Dante Dowdle. Jamarian Wilcox is a guy who's coming back for them off the injury
Yeah.
report. And you got to make Zach Calzada throw this damn ball.
Yeah.
85 yards last week, an interception. My bold take of the game is that Calzada is going to throw for under 125 yards.
Mhm.
I don't see this defensive line allowing them to run the ball at the rate that they did last week. And more importantly, I don't think the secondary and linebacker core are going to be, open to allowing Zach Calzada to make reads and find open receivers. I think the defense is on a whole nother level, especially with a guy like Calzada in the mix. But similarly, it feels like I'm talking about the game last year
Yeah.
with their quarterback who's now working a 9 to 5. So there's a lot of things to unpack here, but bottom line is I think that defense is really going to have to come to life, especially on the road there in Lexington.
Yeah, it's funny how we go from Brock Vandergrift to Zach Calzada this year. But look, I think it starts with what I just said, the time of possession. How does the Ole Miss defense get off the field in the moments that they need to get off the field? When those third downs come, are you able to get into the backfield and actually sack Zach Calzada, or are you just getting in the backfield, making him get out of the pocket, and he's still dumping it off to his running back, passing it for a first down or rushing for a first down, which he got a rushing touchdown against Toledo last weekend. How do they get off the field on third down? Is going to be huge. Limit the time of possession for the Kentucky offense. You don't want Dante Dowdle to get off and control their game of offense. The Ole Miss rush defense is going to have to show up this weekend, but they also have to contain the pass and keep the ball in front of him. I thought one of the big things that also really hinted at for the Ole Miss defense last year was the big playability for the Kentucky passing game last year. You remember the fourth down late in the game, and who in their right mind is calling that? Well, Mark Stoops felt like he had to do what was best to win that game. He did, and it was a big risk, and it worked out for him. Those opportunities are going to happen for this Kentucky offense again. But how does the Ole Miss secondary keep the ball in front of them, limit those big plays, and as well tackle in the open field really well? It was something that Lane Kiffin talked about, that he thought that the defense just needed to tackle in the open field just a little bit better. And I agree as well. That's something that, if you want to limit the big plays, is going to be huge. On the Ole Miss offensive side, I think Bryson Sanders said it best. They won the game Saturday against Georgia State, but it didn't feel like they won the game to them. How do they respond? How do leaders like Bryson Sanders, Jaden Williams, Diego Pounds respond to, in a way, the big mess that it seemed like against Georgia State? You have to sit back, understand the intangibles. Okay. Injuries are still going around a little bit on the offensive line. You didn't have the whole group there together working chemistry wise throughout the entire fall camp. Patrick Kudus was in and out. Jaden Williams seemed to have some differences. You seem to have some freshmen on that line now. Delano Townsend looks to be a probable. Okay. We get it. It's a lot. But how do you collectively now come together, watch the film against Georgia State, take what happened and learn, grow, and move on from what happened this past weekend? You can't let this thing linger in your mind. You can't let Georgia State linger in your mind. You can't let last season linger in your mind. And I get it. The Ole Miss fan base is hungry. The fans, want revenge and what happened last year. But in my personal opinion, I think when you let too many things overtake your mind, when you let the revenge overtake your mind, when you let the offensive line struggles last week overtake your mind, the mindset of going 1-0, which the players have talked about a lot, have talked about in previous years a lot, gets thrown out the window. The trust your teammate, trust your play, do your job, trust the playbook, trust the coaches gets thrown out of the window when your mind is clogged with those things. So for the offensive line, how do you just do your job? How do you trust the call? How do you trust the coaches? How do you trust how hard you've worked in your life to get to this point? And it's doing the intangibles right. It's trusting your teammates. It's trusting your quarterback. It's also understanding that, look, Austin Simmons showed some mobility against Georgia State. He
Yeah.
can move around. He can use his legs really well. So what does that mean for the Ole Miss offensive line this weekend? You need to hold your blocks a little bit longer, if possible, than maybe previous quarterbacks. You're going to have to hold those blocks for Austin Simmons because when receivers are trapped, when they're not getting open, then he has the ability, as we saw last weekend, to use his legs. But does he have the great ability if the offensive line aren't holding their blocks for as long as possible? No. But I think everything's going to be just fine within that offensive line. I think they understand the task at hand. I think they have a great relationship with their quarterback. But as well, as much as the struggles happen in the passing game, Keywan Lacey looks to be everything that I thought he was going to be throughout fall camp. The coaching staff obviously thought he was going to be, making him running back one. And that obviously is going to continue to build well with the offensive line, protecting them strongly. But I think he still has enough tangibles to do good things if they're not on their P's and Q's every single snap. But the offensive line has to get better, and it has to get better with every play and has to get better with every game. Now, saying those things, does it really happen? Does Bryson Sanders just come out and say that after, Tuesday when we met him, and does anything really change? We'll see Saturday. But I think it all starts with the offensive line. I think it starts with, okay, Austin Simmons got some of his headaches out of the way last weekend. He made some rookie mistakes. He got a little bit handsy with things, and it got a little bit too much, it felt pressurized. First road test in the SEC as a starter. What do you look to do to get him happy and comfortable? Start him out easy, get the run game open so the play action passes can become open for him. You talked about Daquan Wright earlier. They will try to mix Caleb Odom in, I would assume, with him. It was really refreshing to see him get his first official touchdown last weekend and know that he can play in that tight end role. You saw Charlie Wise Jr. use him in a lot of pre-snap motion plays behind the line of scrimmage. You'll see that again with Caleb Odom this weekend. Those are the things I'm going to be looking out for. But it's what I would say on that tight end spot. Don't forget about Trace Bruckler. I know you didn't see him last weekend, but he worked really hard in fall camp. And I think when that moment comes, if needed, he will be ready to be put on that line of scrimmage to pass and run a block, to be a red zone guy in the tight end position. I think the tight end room is really, really an underrated group within this team, especially with Luke Hasz coming on the horizon within the next few weeks as well.
I agree, man. And a lot of good points there from Dalen. But the one I want to kind of amplify here is that the run game, because last year I think it was one of the primary reasons that Ole Miss couldn't move the football against Kentucky. In addition, obviously, Jackson Dart not having a whole lot of time to even pass the ball. But Keywan Lacey has to establish himself early in that game. Kentucky has a very good defensive line again. Mark Stoops is a defensive-minded coach. He's proven that he knows how to manipulate and kind of mess around with Kiffin a little bit. So if you can't run the football, you're probably going to have some trouble throwing it, especially weather conditions. If there's a potential chance to rain. So there's quite a few things. Obviously, we can sit here and give you 3 hours of potential analysis and things that might happen. But bottom line is you got to go. They say it all the time, dude. You got to bring your run game on the road. And that's what's really going to start to feel this Ole Miss offense. The last kind of segment I want to dive into, Dalen, score predictions. I have Ole Miss winning 24-17. You can check it out. Check out our predictions on the rebelwalk.com. But I submitted that I think Keywan Lacey is going to score at least one touchdown, and I think he's going to be the player of the game for Ole Miss. And if we lose, it will be a very sad day on this podcast. That's all I have on that.
I'm going to go the same Kentucky score as you. I'm going to go 17 Kentucky, but I'm going to go 31 Ole Miss. I thought I saw enough from the passing game this past weekend with Daquan Wright, with Caleb Odom getting involved, with Harrison Trey Wallace as well. I think I saw enough from that to feel Austin Simmons feels comfortable with his receivers, and it felt like in a way, the two big guys as well, Caden Lee and Deshaun Stribling, had a little bit of a quiet weekend. Don't forget about those guys. Those were, in my opinion, the Caden Lee coming back was the marquee guy from last year, and Deshaun Stribling was the marquee receiver from the transfer portal. Those two guys, have the superstar abilities. They have the big number, history. They can do really great things. And I thought we saw a pretty good plethora of things, in terms of Austin Simmons using all the resources around him this past weekend. But I think 31-17 is going to be my final score prediction. I think my big key as well. How does Austin Simmons control the Kentucky secondary? I watched him a lot against Georgia State, and again, rookie mistakes, young guy, but his eyes were very taunting. Sometimes he was staring his receivers down a little too much, and the Georgia State secondary was catching on to that at times. How do you now move on from that and continue to grow in terms of reading the progressions, reading the coverages? That comes with more and more game experience. So I'm expecting a little bit of differences from that. I know it's only week 2, but going 31-17 Ole Miss victory in Lexington. It's going to be a fun one, though, man. It's crazy that this is a series, man, that since Lane Kiffin has been at Ole Miss, it's kind of been back and forth.
Yeah.
He's 2-1 against Kentucky since being at Ole Miss. The 2022 game was a close one. In 2020, that game at Kentucky as well, it went into overtime, and I think it was like a 49-46 win for Ole Miss that year. So this has been a fun series. Him and Mark Stoops go back to Lane Kiffin's Fresno State days. So they have a long history. These two teams have a long history. It's going to be a fun one. I think that Ole Miss has the ability to prove a lot of things that people are saying they can't do really well. And I think that they're going to come out really hungry. They want to obviously win this game, but as well, they want to make a statement. They want to say, okay, new quarterback, young quarterback, seems to be a struggling offensive line, but we can go on the road in this conference and win big. They want to say, okay, you guys question our secondary in this all season. You guys question whether our defense could be as good as it was last year. First road game on the SEC. We're going to show you guys just how good this defense is. So Ole Miss has a chance to shut some doubters up, and it's going to be a fun one. It's going to be a scrappy one, and I think it's going to be a good one for both fan bases. But I'm going Ole Miss 31, Kentucky 17.
I love it. Like you said, this is an incredible opportunity for Ole Miss to really establish themselves. It's not just a top 20 team in the AP polls, but a team who can find their way in the playoffs and make some national noise, man. Like I'm ready for all that energy to get back here in Oxford and to kind of get some momentum heading into Arkansas, Tulane, and then LSU week as well. That's all we got for you guys today. As always, continue to tune into the rebelwalk.com for all your Ole Miss sports needs. Tune in tomorrow, 2:30 kick. Hopefully the Rebels will go 2-0, but we'll shoot back some content for you next week, recapping the game. That's all I got. Appreciate you guys listening. Hotty toddy and go Rebs.